have Dr. Joel D. Biermann, who is the Waldemar A. and June Schwitt Professor of Systematic Theology at Concordia Seminary, St. Louis. His most recent book is Day 7, For Work, Rest, or Play. He is also the author of A Case for Character, Towards a Lutheran Virtue Ethics, published in 2014. Our second speaker is Father Michael S. Sherwin, OP. He's Professor of Fundamental Moral Theology and Director of the Institute of Spirituality at the University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, and previously taught at the University of Freiburg, Switzerland. Father Sherwin is the author of several articles on the psychology of love, virtue ethics, and moral development. His book, By Knowledge and by Love, Charity and Knowledge in the Moral Theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, has become a standard Thomistic reference. Alistair McIntyre has described Father Sherwin's published collection of essays on love and virtue as theological reflection at its best. Let us welcome Dr. Joel Biermann.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in this company. I feel always somewhat intimidated. My avocation, frankly, is a pastor. So I approach things from a pastoral standpoint, teach because I like to teach. And so I will approach my paper from the same perspective, but drawing from Luther as well. So I'm going to run the risk of actually reading a paper, since I took the trouble to write it, and I'll run it that way, even though I much prefer to just lecture, but I'll do the work I've done and make the benefit by actually reading my paper for you today. I was asked the title last night. The title is Learning to Be What You Were Created to Be. So there's the title, Michael. Now I remembered it. So, Learning to Be What You Were Created to Be. I was convinced long ago to throw in my lot with those who reject facile division between theory and practice, or between doctrine and ethics, or between thinking and doing. What one believes is manifest in what is done, and what is done forms and shapes what is believed. It is the patent anthropological sociological truism at work in the lex orandi, lex credendi axiom that categorically undergirds all human existence. Not a matter of a theological axiom, a simple truism of how human beings are. Making that commitment clear about my connection of these two is really only necessary to the degree that modernity, with its privileging of a siloed intellect and rationality, still holds sway over Christian thinking, which I think is too often the case. Scripture and Christian confession have never operated with tidy divisions between heart, head, and action. Good teaching must attend to both right thinking and right acting together, without prioritizing or emphasizing one or the other, much less trying futilely first to establish right thinking and theory with the vain hope of then achieving the splendid outcome of good practice. From this perspective, the best pedagogical frameworks or paradigms, I believe, are ones that faithfully capture and present basic truths about reality, that is what we might call theory, even as they orient and direct concrete specifics of people's lives. In other words, practice. Now, being a Lutheran, it should come as no surprise that I read and quote Luther. And when it comes to virtue and the formation of human character, Luther has, frankly, a good deal more to say and offer than conventional portraits might lead one to believe. Now, to be sure, a researcher will look in vain for Luther to present a theory about virtue or human character or formation or even sanctification for that matter. In fact, Luther was not particularly inclined to offer theories or hypotheses about much of anything. Luther was not a philosopher or a pure humanist, and I would argue that he was even less an academic than he was simply a churchman. While he may have been a professor of the Bible, he was driven most of all by a pastoral heart. Luther cared about people. He cared about people living in the peace, the security, and the confident joy that God intended for His creatures. He cared about people knowing God's truth so that they could receive and then live in the fullness of the gifts that God freely offered. While Luther was supremely interested in God's truth about salvation and eternal life, he was also keenly interested in God's truth about life in this world right now. He was convinced that human life was not only a matter of preparing to die, but also a matter of learning to live well now, in the present, in the light of God's plan for his creation. Luther was interested in all of these temporal and material things, not for their own sake, or for the sake of maintaining political or ecclesial authority, or even for the sake of academic inquiry, much less for the sake of personal justification. No, he cared about them because they were simply God's truth, and God's truth made life right and made life matter for everyone. In light of this foundational context, shaped and driven by pastoral concerns, I need to make two things clear. First, when it comes to the virtues, Lutherans, well, at least I'll admit this Lutheran, shaped as I am by what I have learned from the first Luther, are not necessarily interested in a virtue ethic for its own sake. Nor is there a great deal of enthusiasm for promoting any particular theory or even for crafting a new Lutheran version of virtue ethics. A Lutheran interest in virtue or even in ethics of virtue or any kind of ethics is really not a matter of sorting out and choosing between competing theories or ideas or thinkers. Rather, the Lutheran interest in virtue and ethics is content with helping people to receive and embrace all of God's truth and then to live the sort of meaningful, purposeful, and joyful lives that God's truth creates and sustains. It's rather simple. The second significant consequence of Lutheranism's typical pastoral approach and emphasis is the overwhelming centrality and primacy of the gospel above all else. Now, I have learned the hard way that the gospel and its proclamation should never be counted as safely assumed and left unsaid. And so please indulge my own pastoral proclivities for just a moment or two as I indulge my own need to recount the heart and center of Christian proclamation as Lutherans like to tell it. Nothing, absolutely nothing matters more than the fundamental reality that in Jesus Christ, God Himself joined His creation in order to reclaim His creation. Though the entire creation was broken, corrupted, languishing, and destined for destruction because of the willful rebellion and sin of the chief creature and steward of the creation, God did not reject it, or even the man who had ruined it. Instead, God acted to restore the man and the creation. Even when man's wicked rebellion culminated in rejecting and killing God's own Son, God raised Jesus, defeating sin, death, and hell, and so providing the only way of salvation for all people. This gospel work of God was accomplished and continues still today, apart from any human contribution. God's love is granted, not deserved. His grace is given, not earned. The gospel is the blessed exchange or the sweet swap. Jesus takes my sin, and I receive His righteousness. The gospel is the heart of it all, the central doctrine. We are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ alone. A teaching like that, overwhelming grace lavishly given, the ultimate rescue on the final day of resurrection, and everlasting life in God's eternal kingdom, all of it freely and fully received, well, that has a way of eclipsing everything else. And that's fine. God's gospel understandably and rightly surpasses and swallows up every other teaching or idea, whether pagan or Christian. The gospel truth that God's fallen creatures are now graciously made right with their Creator, with their fellow creatures, and with themselves, it deserves the central place in preaching and teaching. It is the core, the essential teaching. But it is not the only teaching. And while the gospel engulfs every other teaching in some way, it does not contradict or eradicate any of God's remaining truth, not even the truth of God's law. The truth of the gospel does not compete with or defeat the truth of the law. Indeed, the gospel restores and recenters all of God's truth. The everlasting life given by the gospel begins now, and it is manifest in lives that are lived as new creatures now. Creatures who delight in God's will, God's design, and God's plan for His creation, which in other words can be said as God's law. The gospel puts creatures back into right relationships with God and with one another, and empowers those newly remade creatures to begin living now in willing, eager, joyful conformity to God's will. It is here, in the teaching, the studying, and the keeping of God's will, His law, that Christians practice the art of ethics, simply because that is what God's redeemed and forgiven creatures do. That the gospel can be so central and coexist with the law in a significant and meaningful way often beguiles and confounds many Lutheran thinkers, writers, and no doubt parishioners and other Christians as well. Since the earliest days of the Reformation, rightly explicating and then teaching the distinction and the relationship between gospel and law, between divine monergism, God doing all the work, and human accountability, man actually having a will that is accountable, between grace freely given and a Christian life ardently pursued, well, this tension has confused and crippled not only academic theologians and churchmen, but also those who sit at their feet and then those who are obliged to learn from them. And yet the framework for keeping all of this straight has also been present from the very beginning. It's just not always well recognized, retained, or taught. The central human reality of living at once in the gospel of freedom and in the law of responsibility was neatly articulated already in 1520 when Luther wrote his little treatise, The Freedom of the Christian. And he had the intent in this treatise, his own intention as he declared was to unpack the whole of Christian life in brief form. And the basic premise is expressed in two rather famous pithy sentences back to back at the beginning of the treatise. A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. The two statements are often, and I would argue, wrongly described as paradoxical. But there is no contradiction, no logical imposition, no forced relationship at work here. Rather, the two stark statements are the simple reality of Christian existence lived in light of the two fundamental relationships, one with the Creator, the other with fellow creatures. Within each sphere, there is a way to be rightly and fully human. One is shaped by the gospel, and the other by the law. This means then that there are two distinct ways for a human to be righteous or rightly related, which I would argue is what dikaiosune, righteousness, really is meaning in proper relationships. We are right before our Creator and then right before creatures. Before her Creator, the Christian receives the grace, forgiveness, and righteousness of Christ, and so is fully justified and made entirely righteous. It's a done deal. She now lives without burden, debt, or obligation, a free Lord of all. And meanwhile, and at the same time, before her fellow creatures, the same believer at the same time lives in relationships in which she has work to do for the sake of those around her. She is a dutiful servant of all. The Christian is a righteous Lord of all, declared so by God, and as a newly christened creature, she spends her life learning to live into that new reality in the earthly relationships in which she has been placed. Filled with God's Holy Spirit and living in Christ, she strives to become what God created her to be, a creature, accomplishing her purpose within the world. It is in the temporal sphere where life is lived, in the horizontal realm, realities of relationships and responsibilities, that morality, the cultivation of virtues, character formation, the pursuit of the good, and increasing conformity to a heteronomous telos all become not only exceedingly interesting, but critically important for the sheer sake of being human and living a worthwhile life that matters. There is a basic and universal telos for which every human has been created. That broad telos is then made peculiar and particular by the myriad details that define each individual human life. A person's telos is established then not by cultural consensus, not by religious tradition, scientific discovery, individual choice, or certainly not by personal preference. A person's telos is established and revealed by God. Man's basic telos is to be the creature God intended for the sake of the surrounding creation. The broad goal, then, is manifest in all the countless instantiations of human being that comprise each human life. Striving to attain one's own telos means at the outset learning to conform to the plan of God and so to attend to the design for human life that He has built into the creation itself. This plan or will of God is His law. So it is that creatures who know God's grace and embrace His plan for their lives are keenly interested in the law that God has established for the right functioning of His creation. This way of thinking about the meaning and purpose of human existence finds its scriptural grounding in God's work of creation recorded in Genesis. In both biblical accounts of creation, man's purpose is explicit. Man is created to care for God's creation. His very being is founded in His purpose. He exists to serve as God's representative, God's image in His creation. He is God's steward in the creation. Man lives to serve the creation around him. And so when man does that well, he is fulfilling his purpose. And his reason for being is manifest in his very being, a creature fully material and fully spiritual together at once. Man is mud, sculpted by God's hand, then filled with God's breath. Man does not live for himself. He does not live to actualize his own full potential. He does not live to be all that he chooses to be. He does not live to improve himself or even perfect himself. Man is not on a lifelong personal mission to achieve his own individual telos. Indeed, he does not exist for his own sake at all. Rather, he exists purely for the sake of the particular part of the creation into which he has been placed by the Creator. His telos directs him into this outward-centered way of being human. Now, the inevitable struggle, failure, and final inability of every human creature that will be encountered as he strives to fulfill his task, in other words, the hard reality of this sin-soaked human condition, inevitably and usually quickly chastens and defeats every human. And yet this personal sin and failure is not the last or most important word about a person's identity or reality. All of man's sin, all of his failure, is already fully covered by the redemptive and restorative work of Christ. A person does not need to justify her existence or gain her standing with God. She is God's forgiven creature by virtue of God's grace. And so man does not live to justify himself. Jesus has already done that. He is forgiven and restored as a creature with a secure identity and secure future. He will arrive at his telos. Christ himself will see to that. And so now, freed from the need to save or justify herself and gifted with a clear sense of her life's purpose and direction, a Christian can get busy, not seeking God's favor or trying to justify her existence or secure her identity, but she can get busy with the work that God has given her to do for which she was created. God sends His redeemed creature back into the world to do the work she had always been created to do. This is the crux of Luther's dynamic and powerful paradigm of the two kinds of righteousness. It fully accounts for both the sweet comfort and divine monergism of the gospel, as well as the perpetually unfinished and endlessly challenging work of creaturely responsibility expressed in the demands and the direction of God's law. Both of these aspects of the Christian life, the vertical relationship with God the Creator and the horizontal relationship with fellow creatures, drive the human to forget about his own need and his own righteousness. Indeed, God's reality leads each Christian to self-forgetfulness and self-denial and drives the Christian outward from self-centeredness. Luther succinctly expresses this dynamic precisely and powerfully in that same treatise, The Freedom of the Christian, where he writes, "A Christian lives not in himself, but in Christ and in his neighbor. Otherwise, he is not a Christian. He lives in Christ through faith, in his neighbor through love. By faith, he is caught up beyond himself into God. By love, he descends beneath himself into his neighbor." Obviously, this way of living in the world, this complete dismissal of the self, flies in the face of all the established foundations and all the standard assumptions at work in every self-improvement pep talk, virtually every Christian living book, and even most approaches to Christian counseling and personal thriving. The true Christian wisdom expressed so pointedly by Luther subverts all the therapeutic underpinnings of the present age. Self-love is not the goal. It is not even the first step. Self-focus is fundamentally ruled out. Faith toward God and love toward neighbor, that's the Christian life expressed through the framework of two distinct kinds of righteousness. A passive one, coram Deo, before God, and an active one, coram mundo, before the world. Contrary to the old running joke about the patent incapacity for Lutheran theology to contribute anything of significance to the ethical task, one that's too often true, this foundation of two kinds of righteousness, so central to a rightly articulated Lutheran approach to the Christian life, provides, I believe, an exceedingly sturdy foundation for robust ethical work. In fact, true Lutheran doctrine does not subvert, but actually enhances the pursuit of Christian ethics. In other words, a Lutheranism that would have the gospel trump the law and cast it out of the ongoing reality of Christian living is emphatically not a faithful expression of right Lutheran teaching. As noted, the law plays a critical role for the Christian as a clear expression of God's will for the best way to live within the structure or the design of the creation. This idea is nicely captured by the Formula of Concord, which asserts that the word law has one single meaning, namely the unchanging will of God, according to which human beings are to conduct themselves in this life. This understanding of the law certainly aligns with what is often labeled then as natural law. But considering all the baggage, entailments, and raft of liabilities that drag along behind that term, perhaps we can just refer to the comprehensive, encompassing design of God that has been hardwired into the very fabric and being of every part of creation, maybe just as the creational law. That's been my preferred term. Thinking of God's law this way expands it well beyond a mere list, even beyond the exalted list of the Decalogue. Thinking about the law, the creational law, also liberates us from casting the law as only negative, crushing, enslaving, and a killing word from God, and enables us to see instead the law as simply the structure or the design God has established for the right functioning of the creation. This means that when humans feel the weight or sting of the law, the problem is not the law, but their own sin. And when forgiven and justified Christians are living as the humans God designed them to be, they are necessarily living in conformity with the creational will of God, the law of God. It must also be said and stressed that the role of the gospel in all this is just to forgive and restore sinners. The gospel does one thing, and is one vitally important thing. It puts broken sinners back into a right relationship with God and with the world. The gospel brings individuals into God's grace and returns them to their right place in God's story. The gospel makes Christian ethics possible. There is no Christian ethics if there are no Christians, after all. But the gospel does not create, shape, direct, or I would argue even guide Christian ethics. One of the more tragic mistakes of many Lutheran thinkers has been the effort to conceive or even practice a gospel ethics. But the result is inevitably the mutilation of the gospel as it is distorted into a law that demands and expects. There is no gospel-shaped ethics. There is no gospel-directed way of life. The gospel is, in the strict sense of gospel, just a gift. It does not direct, demand, or expect. All of those necessary and exceedingly good tasks and critically important tasks for human life are the apt province of the law and the law alone. Ethics, then, is the work of discerning, teaching, and living in accord with the creational law, the will of God, not to be sure in an effort to win favor with God, but merely to fulfill faithfully the purpose for which humans were created. We are redeemed and restored in our relationship before God in order to be sent back into the world to serve our neighbor there. We strive for the telos of being fully human, not for the sake of ourselves, but better to serve the world around, according to God's good plan. Obviously, living this kind of Christian life is not easy. Luther frequently invoked the unholy trinity of forces fighting against us, of the world and Satan himself and our own sinful flesh. And yet we strive in this to become the telos we are to be. And our example in this, frankly, is Jesus Christ. Not according to his divinity, but according to his perfect humanity. We do embrace the imitatio Christi. Now, Luther knew that this was not an easy task. Up against the challenge of sin, Satan, on our own flesh, striving to become like Christ for the sake of becoming fully human, it's an ongoing task. So, while Luther could exult in the certainty of the gospel and his status as genuine saint in Christ, he could also admit the continuing struggle that remained. Early in his career, he wrote, "So long as we are on this earth believing in his word, we are a work that God has begun but not yet completed. But after death we shall be perfect, a divine work without sin or fault." We shall be perfect, even as in Christ we are now already perfect, according to God's declaration. Later in the same treatise, Luther made the point even more strongly, and his words sound frankly, confoundingly un-Lutheran. And yet when heard in light of the two kinds of righteousness, they are not only right, but they make complete sense. They provide a fertile ground for a zealous pursuit of ethics and the cultivation of true virtue. Luther wrote, "This life, therefore, is not godliness, but the process of becoming godly, not health, but getting well, not being, but becoming, not rest, but exercise. We are not now what we shall be, but we are on the way. The process is not yet finished, but it is actively going on. This is not the goal, but it is the right road. At present, everything does not gleam and sparkle, but everything is being cleansed." So Luther wrote, and so we strive to live. Thank you.
So, learning virtue, a challenge of Christian pedagogy. The challenge is twofold. We can talk about the challenge of virtue in the Christian life of grace. Because on the one side, there's pagan elitism versus Christian universality. So as we'll see from some quotes from Aristotle, and as we already saw a little bit in Venerable Bede's concern about starting the virtues early, there's a kind of training that's necessary for the ideal of virtue in the pagan tradition, and yet the Christian experience, and you can go through the list, Augustine's adult conversion, the experience in the garden at Milan, or he's suddenly able to do something he wasn't able to do before. We can go to someone that I like to use is Matthew Talbot, who basically lived to drink, and then had an experience on a Saturday morning that radically called this whole way of living into question, and overnight stopped drinking and changed his life from using his wages to drink to support charitable activities all over the world. Or you can think about John Newton, the ship captain, who in the mid-Atlantic has this experience of saving grace, turns his ship around and goes back to Africa. So there seems to be a tension between the elitism of pagan notions of virtue, and then this universal call, and that pagan labors versus God's grace of conversion. So there's a tension there in the whole notion of Christian virtue. The other problem that we have to confront is that the Greek word arete only really occurs in two spots in the entire New Testament. This is not by accident. The New Testament authors know that there's something about the Greek notion of excellence that could be misunderstood. So they limit it. So if we go to the comparison here, here's Aristotle on the politics. Most people are, quote, from the hour of their birth marked off for subjection. The whole notion people talk in Aristotle, that Aristotle had this notion of natural slaves. But the being a natural slave was not really in their nature, but in their education. That is, in the poverty of their background. They didn't get the moral formation that would allow them to be their own guides through life. They needed to be guided by someone else. And so he then says, in the ethics, it makes no small difference whether we form habits, and then again, it's a hexis here, of one kind or of another, but from our very youth, it makes a very great difference, or rather, it makes all the difference. So the Nicomachean ethics saying, if you're going to be a person of virtue, you need to begin young. And yet, Philippians, which is one of Philippians 4:8, is where one of the few places in the entire New Testament where the word arete appears. If there's anything true, anything good, if there is any arete, think on these. Okay, so it's all in the context of St. Paul talking about the kenosis of Christ. And what does he say? God is at work in you both to will and to do. So somehow your moral excellence is rooted in God's action in your life. I can do all things, Paul says, in him who strengthens me. So the mystery of our life in Christ, seemingly very, very different from what Aristotle is talking about. So one of the reasons why perhaps the New Testament avoids the word virtue. The question was raised earlier whether charity or love is a virtue. It was a early church challenge as to why we should call faith, hope, and charity arete, why we should call them virtues. And you had to make a theological argument for what had become theological practice. And if we had time, we could go into how they justify it. But we should recognize that what we call theological virtues, that's a theological reflection on the realities of the New Testament that are not themselves called virtues. The other place where virtue is used is in 2 Peter. And I'm going to end my reflections by looking at how a New Testament attempt to appropriate and transform the Greek language of virtue. But, okay, so you've got these infused virtues versus acquired virtues. The tradition of theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity, are in us by grace. They are given to all the baptized. And then, and this is not a universally held view, but it is held by the students of Aquinas, infused cardinal virtues. That is, besides theological virtues, Thomas asserts that there are infused cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, courage, and temperance, although that's a terrible translation of sophrosune, concerning those things necessary for salvation. So the minimum requirements of the gospel. Interesting. Now, so you have a contrast, acquired virtue and infused virtue. So Aquinas, when he teaches, he's drawing on a few principles. One, to understand the less evident, the less known, we draw analogies from the more evident, the more known. So what does it mean for God to be a father? Well, we have to appeal to human experience of fatherhood to try to understand something about what it means for God to be a father. Also negating all the imperfection. Okay. When we try to understand the workings of grace, we appeal by analogy to the workings of nature. So for Aquinas, following St. Paul, he thinks that there are stages of natural growth, and so therefore there might be stages of growth in charity. And so again, when we talk about, there's a when that's missing there, when we talk about growth in the infused virtues, we do so by analogy with the acquired virtues. So it might be interesting, therefore, to look and see how some of our pagan neighbors do that. Oh, also, a little learned parenthesis. The growth that Aquinas has here, the way in which he justifies talking about growth in infused virtue, is by analogy with natural growth of certain plants, trees. So again, for Catholic tradition, growth in the infused virtues is according to the mysterious economy of merit, whereas Augustine says, even our merits are his gifts, are God's gifts. So Aquinas employs the analogy of a sudden growth of a tree that has long appeared dormant in winter. This spring, seeing the different trees in our garden in Rome, suddenly, almost overnight, new growth appears on what looked like could be a dead tree. You never know whether it's going to come back the next year or not. And this is the California redwoods do this spectacularly. You can be walking along, and the very next day or hours later, you see the new growth on the end of these redwood trees. So we do actions like in acquired virtue, but the growth, well, in infused virtue, that's according to the mysterious merit, providential governance of God. But nonetheless, the analogy is with what people who are students of human nature, someone like Aristotle, asserts. For as regards those things we must learn how to do, we must learn by doing them. So the topic is teaching virtue. Can you teach virtue in the classroom? No. Finished, end of talk. But there are some things you can do in the classroom. We learn by doing them. For example, by building houses, people become house builders, and by playing the sitara, they become sitara players. So too, then, by doing just things, we become just. Moderate, that's sophrosune, it's a terrible translation. We have a very hard time knowing how to translate sophrosune into Latin or English. Moderate things and courageous things, we become courageous by doing courageous things. Now, someone who's interesting to look at because he was an educational genius, he is also contemporary of the earliest Christians. So we don't know exactly when he was born, but not that much after the crucifixion of Jesus. They think maybe around the year 40. And he lived to be 80, so he lived into the second century, about year 120. And he's a Greek, he writes in Greek, but he's a Roman citizen. And so he has very ambivalent views about Roman society, and so he's able to stand back. So he's always interesting. And he has a idealized version of Sparta. And he can get away with celebrating Sparta because, of course, the Romans have weird ideas about Sparta, so he can kind of pass some of his Greek ideas into Roman society. So what does he say? Choral dances and feasts, festivals and hunting, bodily exercise and social converse occupied their whole time when they were not on a military expedition. And he goes on to say, they were chiefly occupied in praising some noble action or censoring some base one, with jesting and laughter, which made the path to instruction, so the path of paideia and correction, easy and natural. So we've already seen some affinities with some of the other talks, the way in which, how do you dispose people to act in a certain way? He didn't know the book of Proverbs, but I don't know, having them sit down and maybe laugh about some of the bad characters in Proverbs, who knows? Okay, so then he sets up people he thinks are models of this. Lycurgus of Sparta, with all the necessary details of life, he blended some commendation of virtue or rebuke of vice, and he filled the city with good examples, and whose continual presence and society must of necessity exercise a controlling and molding influence upon those who are walking the path of honor. And he contrasts it with some of the Romans he doesn't like, but it's very interesting, the contrast. When a wise man has consented to be king over a people newly constituted and pliant to his every wish, what should have been his first care? Unless it was the rearing of boys and the training of youths, so that there might be no confusing differences in their characters, but that they might be molded and fashioned from the very outset so as to walk harmoniously together in the same paths of virtue. Now, one of the things that Plutarch, following Aristotle, following Plato, does is he draws analogies, even though they want to say that arete, virtue, is not techne. Nonetheless, they help explain what virtue is by analogy with the arts, by analogy with sports, dance, music. So one of the last passages here, which I love here, from the very outset, so as to walk harmoniously together in the same path of virtue. That really is the goal, right? Is to form societies to the extent that we can do this in the classroom, to the extent that we can do this in a residential campus. John Henry Newman makes a contrast between the university and then the colleges at a university, where you can form people's behavior, their character, so that we can walk harmoniously together the same path of virtue. Now, the challenge Now, I've been described as an Augustinian Thomist. So there's an Augustinian aspect of Thomism. Thomas was a student of Augustine. There's no doubt about that. And then there's an Aristotelian aspect of Aquinas. So if we're trying to renew the Aristotelian aspect of Thomism, it, I think, has to be part of the whole philosophical return to a more nuanced understanding of Aristotle, engaging the insights of Wittgenstein, Miss Anscombe, Alistair MacIntyre. A quotation from Wittgenstein that keeps coming back to me during our session is, he says in Culture and Value, sometimes you have to take a term out of circulation and send it to the cleaners before you can then put it back into circulation. And so many of our moral terms have suffered that. They mean almost the opposite than what they really should mean. And then engagement with the biopsychosocial sciences, from which, and this is how I want to use the rest of my time, a little bit the analogy with skill acquisition, a little bit on the role of affectivity, and then the unique feature of Christian virtue. So skill acquisition. If you look at some of the best analogies and the best studies of skill acquisition, and then when you look at someone like, we've already mentioned, the Belgian, Dominican, Servé Pinckaers, and his analogies, or MacIntyre working independently at about the same time, his examples, you'll find features of skill acquisition that if we understand them, they'll help us understand aspects, some of the things we've already discussed. What does it mean for something to be a habitus, a hexis, and what does it not mean? What are the role of rules in the life of virtue? What type of freedom does this hexis, does this habitus afford us? Now, one of the great challenges we face is, as people have less and less experience with acquiring technical, and techne in the large sense, if they're less involved in collective sports, if they're less involved in learning how to work with carpentry, if they don't learn how to ride horses, if they don't learn a musical instrument, all the different activities that people used to take for granted. We had a conversation last evening about 2 years before the Mass. One of the most extraordinary things about that book, about the American merchant ships in the 1830s, was how independent and how high the level of culture of the simple sailor in the American merchant marine. They could make their own clothes. They made their own ropes. You go through, if there was a ship was damaged, the carpenters could fix so there were skills that people were in touch with, the crafts, that you could make analogies with the arts and be understood. That's less and less true today. If people don't learn how to sing together, if they don't learn how to dance together, if they don't learn how to be involved with animals, it's much more difficult then to draw the analogies with the life of grace. So, first of all, anyone who's learned learned how to play a musical instrument, there's always someone there that gets them interested in it. So later on, we'll see a slide of Vince Guaraldi. How many people decided they wanted to learn piano when they heard Linus and Lucy from Vince Guaraldi's Charlie Brown Christmas? That is such a brilliant piece of piano with all of the improvisation. And that's another aspect of it. What is the role of the rules? The beginner has to start learning scales. It's repetitious, but they have confidence in the expert, that trust in the expert. If I do what this person's asking me, or learning how to do ballroom dancing, it's very awkward at the beginning. People who start to try to waltz on a 3-beat note, until they learn how to internalize it, it's like marching, boom, boom, boom. But that's not waltzing. But if you're with someone who knows how to really dance, you have to trust that the first steps that they're teaching you to do will eventually lead you to be able to be as smooth a dancer as perhaps they are. That's the goal. All right, so you internalize the rules. The rules don't limit your freedom. They're the condition for the possibility of you eventually being able to play Linus and Lucy with all of the improvisation that makes it your own piece. When George Winston wanted to do a tribute album to Vince Guaraldi, he realized that the improvisations that Guaraldi had done to his own written music had become so standard he had to transcribe them because the public, it didn't sound right if he just played it the way it was written. And he didn't trust his own improvisation, so he learned Guaraldi's improvisation. So it was the creative freedom to create music as he's playing, even when he's supposed to be playing the music that he wrote. All right, so internalizing the rules as you trust the expert to be involved in scales that seem unending, or learning a language, memorizing the grammar, memorizing terminology, and then the social context of learning. You put the learning of your instrument in little concerts with other people who are about the same level as you. Or you have little vignettes where you go to order a cappuccino and you have someone behind, so you learn how to speak a little bit of Italian. The social context of learning, it always has that social context. And then something new. You can play, a jazz quartet, 4 people playing music together that has not been written. It has internalized the standards, the jazz standards, and they do something new together. Or an octet, can you imagine? So the analogy, and this is still on the level of the arts, there's a new freedom that you can do, and they apply this, the ancients, to what they want to call virtue. There's a standard of excellence, someone who embodies the character, who has phronesis, practical wisdom, who lives dikaiosune, who is just, who renders to each one his or her due, that is in his right mind, sophrosune with regard to pleasures, is courageous, is willing to bear the blows of the enemy with hupomone, with patient endurance, has all of these abilities, and they acquire it because they themselves had internalized the rules of right action with regard to the ideal of what it means to be living a thriving human life. They did it as apprentices of a trusted expert. They did it socially with others, learning how to be just, to judge rightly, and they now have a freedom. It doesn't limit their freedom. What justice requires tomorrow, if suddenly the value of your currency falls away, or if your employee is now pregnant, what justice requires tomorrow is not what justice requires today. And if you have the virtue, you have the freedom to respond. The Greeks talked about the kalos, the morally beautiful deed in the kairos, in the present, the critical moment right now. It's like dance. Where to put your foot so you don't step on the foot of the other person at that critical moment. So there's this new freedom that you acquire by having these excellences to do the kalos in the kairos, the morally beautiful deed at the right moment in the right way. So this is seen, there's Guaraldi there. This is seen as being traditionally by stages, again, according to the stages of growth. Aquinas sees the entire life of virtue as growth in charity, growth in love. And you begin with the focus of internalizing the rules, the 10 Commandments. That's what's the stage of beginners. In the Carmelite tradition, it's seen as the purgative way. And then those who make progress, the focus is no longer on obeying the rules, but now on going beyond, having internalized these rules, going beyond to apply them in new and exciting ways that configure you more to Christ. And that's the Sermon on the Mount becomes more priority. And it's described again in the more of the Platonic tradition that the Carmelites have embraced, the illuminative way. It's also the theology of Alexandria. And then the stage of maturity, life in the Spirit, where your friendship with God, which is present at the beginning, now becomes primary. You love God. God becomes your new self. So even when you're loving yourself, your new self is God. It is the God whom you love in loving even yourself. He becomes the whole reason for your love. And this is the stage of those who have attained their goal, the unitive way of the Carmelites. So these stages of growth. But let's get back to the whole question of the role of internalizing the rules. Is this a chair? What constitutes a chair? What are the minimum requirements of a chair? Why is this in a museum and not being used as a chair? So we take a lot of things for granted, but people in the crafts, they can't take these for granted. To make a chair, you have to respect certain things that are rooted in human nature. It's all about the relationship between your ankle and your knee and your hip and your shoulders. These relationships that have been studied make it possible for you to make a chair. We don't go through life thinking about, gosh, what constitutes plumbing that works? For example, why is there that little S underneath your sink? Why is it there? Can I just get rid of it? What would change in my life? You'd find out very quickly. So it is a rule that is rooted in human nature, but does it limit the craftsperson's freedom? Or does it make it possible for the craftsperson to make a chair? So these are the type of questions that we've stopped asking because we're so isolated even from the crafts, and then it's even farther removed from the moral life. The rules of the moral life are not there to limit our freedom. They make freedom possible. You can't play, you cannot improvise in a jazz quartet if you haven't been initiated into the life and practices of Western music. And it doesn't start with jazz. Ornamentation in Baroque music, that's what they were doing. We have the letters from the parish council president, Herr Bach, we love it when you play your hymns, but please stop engaging in so much ornamentation because the choir is losing the thread of your hymn. Bach, like most people who create music, understood that written music is just improvisation written down. He wanted to create as he played. He didn't just want to play again what he had played before, but the choir had difficulty with that. Is that a 5-minute warning? Okay. So it makes this just in a very quick looking up on the internet. That's a store that sells chairs, lots of chairs. The Danes were celebrating a century of Danish chairs. There's lots of them there. There's another company that has 100 different dining room chairs. They all respect the minimal requirements of a chair. That's why their chairs sell. That's why they continue to make them. Picasso didn't, and that's why his so-called chair is in a museum. No one's sitting on it. All right. Now, since I only have 5 more minutes, I'll skip over the role of the affectivity to get us down to, yeah, that's also very good. I'll skip all of that and get us down to visualization, the role of visualization. The Blue Angels, before they fly, they visualize the entire flight. They sit around together and the leader says what he's going to say. Because, their wingtips are like inches away. In order to do that, you have to think it right. You're visualizing. What you think about what you see does influence your behavior. Otherwise, they wouldn't spend all their time doing that. Well, and of course, advertisers know that. And they spend all their time trying to have us visualize other things. Okay, anyway, 2 Peter. 2 Peter, probably the youngest piece of scripture in the New Testament. It's younger than 1 Clement, for example. It's very interesting because it chooses very selectively moral terms. How does it begin? Through his glory and virtue, arete, it's never translated as virtue, but that's what it is. Through his glory and virtue, he has bestowed on us the promises. Now I've cut out a piece there, but anyway, the promises so that through them you may come to share his divine nature, theos koinonoi. Now koinonia is Aristotle's notion. In order for friendship to occur, there has to be a koinonia. So Paul uses koinonia too. But this is, you become koinonoi in the divine nature, theos phuseos. You participate in the divine nature because of his glory and his own excellence, virtue. For this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith. Now, a little peculiarity of Greek, they don't have parentheticals. How do you portray a list in Greek? They do it through repetition. So, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue. What do I mean by virtue? Well, knowledge with self-mastery, enkrateia. That's the primary act of sophrosune, is enkrateia. Self-mastery with patient endurance. Patient endurance, hupomone, that's the primary act, according to Aristotle, of courage. Is courage more about attacking or about bearing the blows of the person who's attacking? He says it's more about bearing the blows. That's hupomone. Okay. So the 2 Peter knows the language he's using. He's using the language of traditional Greek virtue. So supplement your faith, that gift from God that is the beginning of the Christian life, with virtue. What do I mean by virtue? Well, knowledge with self-mastery. Self-mastery with hupomone. Hupomone with reverence. Now this is very interesting. This already goes back to the way they translate the Old Testament in the Septuagint. Eusebeia. I'm translating as reverence. Reverence with filial friendship, Philadelphia. And Philadelphia with agape. So, this is the whole thing about the list. If you restructure this list, what do you have? If you have gnosis taking the place of phronesis, which seems to be, practical wisdom seems to be too much of a human thing. Gnosis is more general. What you have here is the Christian life begins with faith, is animated by charity, and then you've got the 4 cardinal virtues integrated into the Christian life of faith animated by charity. Knowledge, it has a cognitive element, which is both contemplative and practical. Enkrateia, self-mastery, enkrateia, which is the primary act of sophrosune, which is to be in your right mind. The model of sophrosune in the New Testament is the Gerasene demoniac after he's been healed. After he's been healed. He is sophron, fully clothed. Before, he was chained, naked, living among the dead. Now, he's fully clothed. He's at the feet of Jesus. He becomes teachable. All right, so sophrosune, the primary act of courage. Hupomone. So we've got the 4 cardinal virtues. But it's gnosis, a larger understanding, contemplative and practical knowledge. You've got enkrateia, self-mastery, proper to sophrosune. You've got hupomone, patient endurance, which is proper to courage. And then reverence takes the place of pagan justice because it's a larger term and it's religious. Normally translated as piety, but eusebeia is larger than our notion of piety. It's reverence for all things. You render to each thing what is due to each thing. Then you have the love for the fellows, sons and daughters of the household of God. Philadelphia is the love you have for those who are your fellow Christians, and all of this animated by love. So this would be the Christian challenge, to draw in the stages of virtue acquisition in our portrayal, our biblical portrayal of faith, hope, and charity that animates the cardinal virtues. Thank you.
Lutheran pastor, question?
Yeah.
First of all, should the Christian's goal be to grow in the virtues? And if so, what sort of intentional and conscious practices of the virtues should the Christian do?
Yeah, I would say absolutely the goal of the Christian should be to grow in the virtues. As I try to make clear, it's not so much for the sake of self-improvement or my self-mastery, but for the sake of my better fulfilling my task within my vocational responsibilities. And so how do you learn that? Everything that Michael's been talking about here, you know, the practices, the habituation, doing these kinds of things over and over again. Luther believed strongly, start with the 10 Commandments, same as on the list we just saw. And you learn by growing into God's law, in a sense. Large catechism and small catechism of Luther are classic examples of this. You know, teaching the young, learning the liturgy, learning the habits. So yeah, this would be an overt kind of a thing. You have a follow-up?
But you're saying you don't need to learn it for yourself, but for.
The goal, what I'm trying to make clear here is, I think, and this is sort of the emphasis I really want to make clear, is that this is not about for my own sake, so that I become this, or so look what I have achieved. This is never, the focus is never on self. The focus is on what am I here to do? And I think this is sort of the novel thing that gets lost, I believe, in most contemporary thinking about ethics. It's always about what am I supposed to be doing? How do I get better? And the point is, it's for the sake of the neighbor. Now, and the teacher or the parent is going to be very interested in the kind of kid he's raising. And that's where you're going to be, so what do I need to do to help this child arrive at this point of the selflessness? And there are ways of working on that, but it becomes an intentional kind of a thing. Okay?
Yes.
Father Sherwin, you pointed out you said that the distance from the craftsmanship that goes into the care and from the sort of system of rules that make care possible impedes our ability to understand virtue formation, or at least that's how I interpret it as saying. Do you think that means that a sort of restoration of the common arts or skilled trades or craftsmanship is part of the sort of necessary ingredients for restoring virtue formation in a culture?
Yeah, the short answer to that question is yes, but it's a dangerous thing to affirm because you can be misinterpreted. Although personally I would be very drawn to living like a Catholic Amish, I don't think it is the universal call that everyone needs to embrace in order to find their way in the world. But I do think we could find many ways to live a more healthy existence that doesn't alienate us so profoundly from the fact that we are animals, that we share a lot in common with other animals, and that we are going to learn the excellences proper to being human on the way to heaven by being less Cartesian or less alienated from our true selves. And everything, a society that's based on profit maximization, that puts additives in food so that you continue eating even after you don't need to eat. You just go down the list of things that my generation were the guinea pigs for. The children of my generation, we wonder why they are overweight and unhealthy and spend all their time in front of a screen. We have designed their primary role in life is to be consumers. That's what they do for the economy. And I thought that the primary role in life was to know and love God and serve Him in this life and love Him for all eternity in heaven. So we need to reassess how we live together. Yeah. And I think there are a lot of very simple things we can do.
Right here.
Thank you both. It's tremendous. Hopefully this will end with a question. I think it will. When I'm not pastoring, being a husband and father as best as I can, I help coach my son's football team in high school. I want them to be excellent football players. And I think actually, the football field can be a school for virtues, like the many analogies with athletic training, all those sort of things like that. One of my worries as a pastor father is that maybe in terms of Dr. Biermann's kind of discussion was that this excellency in the horizontal realm will bleed into the vertical. So especially these young men are searching for identity, security, and meaning, that will get blocked, that they'll get that, think that their very value as a being becomes linked up with being an excellent football player. I want them to know that the fundamental stuff doesn't change at all, even if they're a horrible football player. You see where I'm going with that? So my question is, and I'm wondering if that's a peculiarly Lutheran anxiety. Would I have different anxiety as a football coach if I had been formed in the Catholic tradition instead of in the Lutheran? And just a couple more sentences on that. What I heard from Dr. Biermann is very, very clear horizontal from Luther's 1520 treatise. The vertical, it's solid, it's there. The gospel proclamation, can't do anything about it. Whereas from the Roman Catholic side, a much more ease with speaking of what was the language? Virtues as part of the minimal requirements of the gospel, a path to instruction, so that these virtues somehow bleed into maybe bleed is the wrong word, but contribute to this vertical relationship. So Lutheran football coaches and Catholic football coaches have different anxieties.
Well, we can go down that. I mean, Lutherans and Catholics have talked about what is the source of our differences and all that. But from my perspective, and I mean, this is my bread and butter. I could spend all my time talking about that. But
Go ahead.
my perspective, it's kind of like arguing about what hymn we should listen to as the Titanic is sinking.
Okay.
Right? So there's much more wrong with how most Americans play football than the issue you're concerned with. And that is what I think we together, together can do a lot, because there's far less injury in English rugby in England than there is with American, even on Pop Warner, even on all of that. You've got many more injuries in American football with all of its techne than you have with almost no techne in the way rugby's played in England. That should worry us. Then the standard of what it means to succeed in football is very scary in terms of what people are willing to do to the opponent's needs, for example. So we're not actually teaching winning in the old traditional sense of what it would mean to be victorious in a team and for a sport. Now, if you were wanting to go to war, but a sport is something different. And so, yeah, there's a lot wrong with the way in which we play football, and we could have a conversation about that. But it's very revelatory of American society. We think we can solve all problems. It's like bringing in the replay to baseball. The umpire is live. Sometimes he doesn't see it right, and you have to learn how to.
I didn't want to overplay the football analogy too much. I get it. And teaching proper tact, all my rugby friends are all about that. So I guess the more fundamental question, that maybe the analogy clouded it, was that given these long-standing conversations about horizontal, vertical sort of things, how those themselves inform, it's very different, I think, from what, Dr. Biermann pointed out, the Luther's 1520 treatise, from the way that those form the Roman Catholic tradition speak of virtues, virtue acquisition, the encouragement of the virtues, the telos, the end of the virtues, that how those differences inform how we speak of the virtues themselves. And maybe it's too big of a topic or too big of a question. Maybe Dr. Biermann, you kind of said, yeah, we're on the same. We can use all this sort of stuff.
I think we are basically kind of in the same place. We're going to make a different emphasis on what it means to stand before God, and but the outcome's the same. Yeah, I want to stand before God as His redeemed creature in the recreated heaven and earth. This is the goal. This is what I would say is to be delighting in God and in His being, and I learn to do that even now. And so, being what God has created me to be is this kind of marvelous congruence of what God gifts and then what I also strive to achieve. And that's that kind of conundrum that confuses, I think, a lot of Christians, and we get it wrong. Living in that kind of twofold reality, I think, is the crux of it all.
Yeah. So,
I have a question for Father Sherwin. I really enjoyed the characterization you offered of the kind of excellence in judgment that one might arrive at the end point of a proper, upbringing. In particular, as you put it, you're able to see the kalos and the keros. And the idea that, we should speak here of the beautiful, it just seems to me quite right, and seeing it in its decisive moment, and being liberated to respond in that way, with the kind of enthusiasm that the potentiality for beauty engenders in us, by a training that includes some repetition early on. That seems quite beautiful. But it seems to me that St. Peter's kind of pushing in another direction, and I'm looking in particular at item 2, the equation of self-control enkrateia with sophrosunia. As I think of what Aristotle is saying about the relation between those two, sophrosune is a higher achievement that does involve this sort of sensitization to the kalos and the keros, and that brings you into unity, whereas self-control is only necessary in an earlier stage when you're not fully awake to how best to act.
Yeah, so Sophrosune, Cicero in the Tusculan Disputations says, I really don't know how to translate Sophrosune. And he gives you a few options. Moderation's one of them. When Jerome is confronted with this, with the Latin, he almost always uses sobrietas. He doesn't like temperantia. Now, the Stoics have a list of actions that are proper to sophrosune. Enkrateia is one of them. The other one is eutaxia, which is to rightly line up your soldiers. That's what we have jumped on by translating it as temperantia. The problem with that is it's not in the New Testament. The New Testament authors don't like that. They prefer enkrateia. Paul uses enkrateia a lot. So we don't. What do we want to say? It's a power that we have over ourselves, but it's in order so that we can be in our right mind. So for Aristotle, the slides I didn't show you, there are two ways in which a public citizen of Athens can lose it on the emotional level. He can either show too much daring, like Cyrus the Younger when he goes out, he sees his half-brother and he goes stupidly and gets himself killed during, it's reported by Xenophon in the Anabasis. So he's got too much daring, stupidly. And then the other is you have too much fear in battle. So for courage, what causes the most fear? Well, it's not attacking. Think of a hoplite. The two primary acts of the courageous person for Aristotle is to attack and to bear the attacks. And he says bearing the attacks are the act that's primary to courage. And Paul picks that up. Hupomone, patient endurance, is everywhere in Paul, and almost always linked to hope. All right, so that's what is in Peter's list as well. It's hupomone. But in public life as a citizen, the two ways in which you can fall into folly, not from fear, it's from disordered attachment to pleasure. So you can be found in the wrong person's bed at the wrong time, or you can be pulled over for drinking too much. So Aquinas will in his commentary on Timothy, say, the reason you should choose bishops among those who are sober and chaste is because these are two areas where you can fall into folly. So public citizens, the Athenian, when he's in battle, he's got to be courageous. But when he's in public life, he has to exhibit sophrosune. And that means you have control over your desire for pleasure. Now, we can turn that into a Stoic thing, but that's not what enkrateia means. It just means that I love pleasures in the right way, so that I'm not with Monica when I should be with Hillary. Because you become foolish. That's what the public citizen is foolish in peacetime by having disordered desire for pleasure. He becomes foolish in battle by being too fearful. Yeah. So enkrateia is that excellence in the New Testament that allows you to be within yourself with regard to your desire for pleasure. It doesn't have to be a Stoic thing where you suppress you just have it rightly ordered. That's a long answer to your question.
Question, excuse me, for Dr. Biermann. You emphasized a lot kind of the selflessness in Lutheran thinking, and I wondered about, the second great commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something about the love you bear yourself that turns out to be quite crucial for how we. So I wonder if you could just clarify
Yeah.
sort of the role of the self.
Yeah.
Right, but, a kind of therapeutic
Absolutely.
understanding of the self versus
Mm.
a proper
Correct.
Lutheran Christian understanding.
Yeah, it's critical to remember, in the age of our hyper-individualism we're living in, we often hear Christians will kind of just bash individualism, but God creates us as individuals. He saves us as individuals. He will raise us as individuals. And so in many ways, Christianity puts a finer focus on individualism than anything else. We're not just lost in the community. We're not just part of the polis. It's individuals that Christ has redeemed, that God has created. So the individual matters. And yet the point then is, though, that the individual doesn't become the focus of things. God, my creator, and the creation around me becomes my objectives, my focus. So the self-love, I think that verse gets often used by the people who want to cultivate, got to love yourself first so you can love other people. My response typically is that self-love doesn't need to be encouraged a lot. My grandchildren at 3 years old are pretty tuned into themselves. And so it's part of I think that kind of nature of things. Now, self-loathing is a problem, and that becomes another as a sin. And in a sense, you're seeing yourself in a disordered way. And I think the focus on the right ordering of things, the taxis lining up, is critically important here. So self-loathing is also wrong because it's an obsession with self again. Whereas the selflessness sees self as creation of God, an individual precious in God's mind for the sake of others. So I'm not wrapped up in myself, and yet I am caring for others as I care for myself. So there's a tension there as well. I agree with that. And so I don't want to turn it into a self-loathing there as the goal. That's not the point here. But it's also, it's very different than the kind of the enlightenmentized individual as the center of life. That's what I'm trying to get across.
Trying to think about how to turn this into a question. Maybe it's an observation.
Just make an observation, that's fine.
Very drawn to your hard distinction between the gospel as the sort of Christ event and the gospel as the origin of Christian ethics.
Yeah.
And I like that. I think you said it for three different ways to just make that point. So
I bet you picked up on that.
it stayed with me. In part because I'm kind of drawn to apophatic theology, not so much as a negation, but as the failure of language and kind of human conception to get at some higher divine truth. So
Right.
not things that we can't say about God, but I'm drawn to that. And so I see in that distinction you're drawing the concept that perhaps we misinterpret, we do a disservice to the singularity that is the Christ event.
Mm-hmm.
By trying to link up, Aristotle's ideas of how all of these virtues develop and so on. And I'm wondering if you take that in other directions as well.
Lutherans love distinctions. I mean, we thrive on all these distinctions, and it can get overdrawn and overplayed because ultimately it comes down to God's single reality. But I do think, I'm glad you picked up on this because this is exactly what I'm trying to get across. I think we make a huge mistake when we try to build a uniquely Christian ethic out of the gospel. That's the problem. That's a problem because the whole point of the gospel is this crazy thing that makes no sense. Grace never makes sense. That's the point. It's not something that fits neatly into the order of things. It just comes blowing in from outside, and God just does His thing. Egypt at the Red Sea. Here comes God. And this is the same idea. This is what grace is. This is what gospel is. And so I think this is one of the contributions of making this sharp distinction. It helps, I think. Now, does this mean grace does not inform how we live as Christians? It informs everything. And can the gospel come rolling into my relationship with my wife all the time? But you see, it's always as this kind of a new way of looking at things, and yet the gospel as gospel isn't what's telling me how to do things, it just enables me, and that's kind of the point. So yeah, I think it does, and it fills out through all kinds of things, I believe, yeah.
So, I'm a Calvinist, so I'm eavesdropping here.
No, that's quite great.
That point really struck me, and I'm drawn to some parables like the unforgiving servant.
Yeah.
or the Pharisee and the publican, or Ephesians 4, where forgive one another as God in Christ has forgiven you.
Yeah.
So that in my own sense of things, it's free gift, yes, but it shapes the response to that gift is a part of it, and so anyway.
No, I agree with that. My counter would be to say that I think I would contend that the whole idea of being fully human, and this is where the imitatio Christi comes in. This is what it looks like to be fully human. This is what it looks like. I don't have Christ's vocation. None of us have that vocation, and yet he's living as a human is meant to live, selflessly, in tune with God, and that's what a full human is supposed to be. So I think even that is, in other words, he's living in conformity with God's will. That's part of the law. Jesus doesn't need gospel because he's in a right relationship. Gospel is this thing that puts you back where you need to be so you can start doing these things. So in other words, I think even the idea of living in mercy, living kindly, that's part of the law. It's part of God's will for how we are supposed to be. And I think that holds for everybody, Christian or not. It's just that Christians have been revealed this more clearly, and we understand it more fully. Yeah, I guess, you didn't ask me a question, but I'll just interject this one more thought. I really am trying to preserve the gospel as being this uniquely strange Christian thing that can't be neatly incorporated into anything else. That's kind of exactly the point. And I think that is what I'm going for. We can learn so much from Aristotle and Cicero, Plato, anything, and it helps us to become better at doing these things that make us more fully human. But the gospel thing is what starts it all, and that's different. It's just fundamentally different.
Father Michael, you brought in the quote from Plutarch about making the path to destruction easy through laughter. And I was wondering if you or both of you would speak to the role that you see humor playing in developing virtue. That doesn't seem, it seems like kind of a foreign concept, like using humor as a way to develop virtue in our society.
Most humorists are, when they become self-reflective, struck by how dark and deep a sense of tragedy they have in their own lives. Whether it's Sam Clemens, who was tormented by a sense of guilt all his life and was tormented by questions of religion that he didn't know how to resolve. So Mark Twain is probably America's greatest humorist, but he was always on the edge of tragedy. Charlie Chaplin, who is arguably the most, his Little Tramp is arguably the most recognized comic figure in the world, even still today, and yet there's a sadness to the Little Tramp, which goes way back to the music hall clowns that he grew up with as he came from a show family. And he talks about how much of his comedy is always on the edge of tragedy. So the literary answer to your question is, life is tragic unless you encounter the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, and you realize that the human tragedy can become a comedy. So Chaucer, at the end of, which I think is his great masterpiece, Troilus and Cresside, not Troilus and Cressida, which is Shakespeare, Troilus and Cresside, once Troilus is now floating up into heaven and he sees how small the world is, he breaks out laughing. So his life is tragic. He's betrayed by the woman who promised never to betray him. He's killed, his people are destroyed, and yet he goes off and can laugh. So humor is only possible, I think, real humor, because it points to the overcoming of tragedy. And the great Czesław Miłosz, he says, if God doesn't exist, who's laughing at us? Right? He had this great sense that someone out there was laughing at our insanity. And Malcolm Rutledge came to faith the same way. He was struck by the weird symmetry that seemed to be that people who did stupid things seemed to be punished in very appropriate ways publicly. And he saw this fearful symmetry in creation And little by little, he began to discover providence. So I think humor is points beyond itself. And to be able to have a good sense of humor means it points beyond the tragedy of this life. So I think it's the Lord uses it to save us from despair.
Absolutely. If there's not joy in your Christian living, if there's not joy in your theology, you've got it fundamentally wrong. It just needs to be there. I know joy and humor are not equivalent, but there's a commonality there.
If I remember correctly, doesn't Aristotle, I mean, he discusses humor in the Ethics. Isn't there a virtue there, right? Because the deficiency would be boring, to be boring. And then I forget what the excess, buffoonish is the excess. So it is to be properly humor, to have proper humor is a virtue.
Yeah, well, he calls it healthy play, eutrapelia.
Okay.
Time for one more question.
Another life example. On this comment that during the 2008 downturn in the economy, my sister's Lutheran church went out for a meal after a church activity, and it was a large group of people, and they were laughing and having a good time. And the waiter, and it's the waiter or the maitre d', somebody said, "It's been so long since I've heard laughter."
Mm-hmm.
And because everybody come to eat out, it's just so somber because of the economy. And it was like, oh, these people are having a good time.
No, I appreciate that. And the real life is what matters, these things. And if we are able to simply delight in what God gives us, the gifts, the creation around us, we should be delighting all the time, that we simply get to participate in these gifts that God gives. No doubt about that. Yeah, that's good. That reinforces the points we've been making, I think, very nicely.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.